So, a little abashed here. Everybody is talking about teaching and frontline stuff. And what I'm going to do is really something quite different. I want to talk a little bit about where does the subject, where does STEM education fit into the economic picture. And it's actually, it turns out, I thought I was going to be more contrarian than I'm going to be, because it turns out that the focus of what I've heard of the discussion is not too much at odds with what I want to say. But in any case, this is just to sort of background. Obviously, it's not news to economists that education is terribly important. We tend to use what I actually think is a pretty bad term. We call it human capital. Which is a bad term because it makes it sound more like it is just like accumulating machinery and so on, and it's not. It's a much harder. It involves human beings, which makes it quite different. But still, we think that education, acquisition of skills is terribly important. There's a lot of research on the relationship between education, accumulation of human capital, and economic growth. Some of which the more recent stuff is a little bit more nuanced than you might think. There's also a lot of misapplication, and maybe so. I'm going to do this. Really, there are three topics, and I'm going to structure this in a way around stuff that you may hear, stuff that you may read in newspapers and in magazines that people often talk about. Which is not needs a little bit of, then you need to pull back a little bit, and then a little perspective on just what all of this means in terms of the economy, and finally what really seems to matter on these things. So let me tell you a story. It's a story that you hear a lot, and it's often a story that's told by people who believe that they're giving you a big insight. And the story is something like this. Well, we're in this world of rapid changes in technology, globalization, unskilled work can be done anywhere. The world is flat. Somebody said that. Anyway, and in that world, the only way that you can compete is by having high levels of skill, having in particular high levels of formal education in the stuff that matters in this advancing technological world, which means, in particular, they think in terms of STEM, and then lots of concern about the position of the United States in particular, which used to have an overwhelming position of leadership in terms of numbers of engineers, in terms of generally number of college graduates, and is that has rapidly eroded as the rest of the world comes up on our levels of education, and that this is kind of integral to our economic problems. And I can give you a kind of representative example here. So this is, actually, if this was an economics audience, everybody would know who Jamie Dimon is. You probably do anyway, right? J.P. Morgan, big. Is it J.P. Morgan or Morgan Stanley? I'm losing my. J.P. Morgan, yeah. Anyway, very, very. Not only a very big businessman, but somebody who's considered to be an intellectual in that group, and was frequently mentioned as Treasury Secretary or whatever. But someone who weighs in, and so this was a piece that he and presumably the other person actually wrote it. But anyway, a piece that he was he had his name on that was in Politico a couple of years ago, and it's saying, well, look, we have a big problem. Which is, and at that point, unemployment was quite high, saying that the problem is that the workforce just doesn't have the skills we need. So this is not a STEM particularly, but it's an education issue. That education is the core of our problem. And you heard that a lot. Actually, a lot of people, among people who said things like this at the time, someone who said something very similar, but I thought I'd put this because it's a coherent paragraph. Bill Clinton was saying similar things at the time. When I saw that, it put me in mind of some stuff I've been reading. I had been reading. So this is a quote, a little bit less strikingly written about, but our present labor supply is just basically our workers do not have the right skills, and even if we try to have a big push on demand, we would have lots of problems, and we wouldn't have the right workers. So where is this one coming from? The answer is it's from an article written in 1935 in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. It's kind of interesting, by the way. The author was not a stupid person. This Ewan Clegg was, for a long, long time, the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Actually, a kind of a legendary figure there. So he was definitely a smart guy, expressing what was a widely held view at the time during the 1930s, that the problem we had in the 1930s is, well, in this time of rapid technological progress and all of these changes, that you cannot. The reason we have mass unemployment that's persisting so long is not just that there isn't enough spending. It's not that we just don't have enough demand. It's that we just have the wrong workforce. And until we radically change and upskill the workforce, we can't possibly have full employment. Well, we know what happened then. Along came a very large program of fiscal stimulus, otherwise known as World War II. And abruptly, we had full employment, and all of those unsuitable, unskilled workers turned out, not only did it turn out we could make use of them, but we could make use of, Rosie the Riveter. We could make use of all kinds of people who had never been in the paid workforce before. So at the time, it turned out that there was not really the skills gap theory of the 1930s turned out to be wrong, and that is happening again. So if we look at I know there's two screens here, which is slightly awkward, but if we look at that, actually that Jamie Dimon thing is written quite a ways into this process. This is the red line is total number of people who are counted as unemployed in the U.S. The blue line is the number of job vacancies reported. There was a big gap. There were lots of people unemployed, but also a lot of job vacancies. Well, what you might have thought were a lot of job vacancies a few years ago. But there's always going to be some reported job vacancies. If companies can fill positions instantly, then they're paying too much, basically, right? If the job is so attractive that they can fill it within an hour, then they should be making it a little bit less attractive, at least from their own point of view. And there's always some people unemployed because people are moving between jobs, or they're searching, but they're not that eager, or whatever. So, and what's happened since then is actually we're back to about the levels of unemployment that we had before the financial crisis, and we're back to job vacancies are a little higher. So there's but it's not a dramatic difference. So, and if you look across the board, there really is there's no indication that the U.S. economy is being held back by a mismatch between the kind of workers that we have and the kind of workers that we need. If there were, one way of us saying that is actually that previous quote about the soaring wages for some kinds of workers while others are reduced to penury. That's what should be happening if we had a really big mismatch, and we do not actually see anybody, any large group of workers that are experiencing huge wage growth, big increases in demand for workers. There are particular skills that turn out to be, at any given time, there are particular skills that turn out to be in short supply. If you look at what those are in the last few years, which groups have had significant increases in wages, they turn out to be kind of funny. We've had some pretty big increases in salaries for lawyers lately. Not quite sure what that's about. We've had a significant increase in wages for skilled sewing machine operators. And that's a particular thing. That what's happening there is that globalization overreached. A lot of companies went in search of the cheapest labor, and then they rediscovered the virtues of having at least some production fairly close to the markets. And so a certain amount of apparel manufacturing started to come back to the U.S., and they discovered that we don't actually have anybody who knows how to run a sewing machine anymore. So but that's not exactly, so not exactly STEM education there. Okay. Now, step back from this immediate. Is there a skills gap? And I think it's pretty clear now that there isn't. That at least that crude version that said we need a more highly educated workforce, we don't have it, and so we can't fill the jobs. That story has turned out not be true. What about the general notion that there are big returns to education? Well, the answer is yes. Highly educated workers are paid a lot more than less highly educated workers. That is something that happened a ways back. It has not been. Well, I'm a little bit out of order, actually, now the way I'm saying it in terms of slides. Let me give you a couple of pictures that might surprise you. This is what's happened to the earnings of college-educated workers at different. And so we're looking at there. Of course, there's a distribution within that. And what you can see is the sort of the second line down. Sorry, the third line down is the median college graduate. And you know what? College graduates have seen no increase in their earnings adjusted for inflation in the past 15 years. Now, it's true that non-college educated workers have also seen no increase in their earnings. But what's striking is that it's not the case now that we have an economy that is delivering big gains to the highly educated, but not to people with less education. It's basically not been delivering big gains to anybody. So that's a little bit of a surprise. Now, that wasn't always true. We'll see that in a couple of slides. But at this point, whatever is going on in our economy now, it doesn't seem to be strongly related to, doesn't seem to be strongly differentially favoring people with education. This is a picture that is, so the results are more striking even when you look at entry level. So obviously, if somebody's been employed for a while, their wages tend to be sluggish in response to changes in the market. If we're looking at startup people who are fresh out of school, you get a better picture. And what you see there is that there was, all right, gosh, how old is the audience here? Many of you, not all of you, remember the late 90s and pets.com and all of that. And during that period, there was a boom in demand for highly educated workers. And then it went away, and nothing like that since. So, but broadly speaking, yeah, there was never a doubling of income for college graduates. But there was a significant increase between the early 80s and around 2000. And since then, it's been basically modestly downhill. So education per se has been no guarantee of doing well in this economy, which is interesting. It doesn't. If your view was that this is the world in which having a high level of formal education is the key to success, then you don't see that actually, at least not for a long time, not in the past 15 years, and maybe a bit more than that. So that it's okay. So education levels are less important, and so that also means, by the way, that a story about what's going on, which says that it's all about technology and about globalization, is not going to work too well because technology and globalization continue to advance, but the wages of people with college degrees did not. One more picture there, which is kind of, I find, and I want to talk a little bit about behind this. This is, after adjusting for a few things, this is what's left, the percentage by which, other things being the same, college-educated workers earn more than workers with just a high school degree. And it's by women and men, and the premium is large for both. And there really was, especially actually for men, if you go back to the 70s, there wasn't much of a premium at all. And so relatively few people in this room, but I'm old enough to remember when a well-paid blue-collar worker often seemed to be making as much as the middle manager down the street. So there was a time when that was really the case, that the premium wasn't large. It then got quite substantial. But has been not doing much since about, since 2000 for sure, and even the pace of change really slowed up. So back up for a second there. What's interesting about that, if you're thinking about the deep economic stories, is that it does not, the stories that everyone wants to tell in terms of timing don't fit this very well. That if we're thinking about technology, the real, there was essentially hardly anybody used the internet in 1990. It barely existed. The globalization, the huge surge of international trade, there was already significant, obviously, by 1990. But when we think about this tremendous increase in international trade, where everything seems to be made in China, roughly speaking, that's a post 1990 and actually even a post 2000 thing. That's something that comes about as China fully enters the world economy, as you have a really large scale. The share of manufactured goods that we import from developing countries was really still quite small in 1990 and really took off. After that, we sometimes talk about hyperglobalization, which is something that really is a combination of opening up of developing countries opening up to the world, and the fall of communism actually as well, and then also big improvements in the technology of international communications and transportation, which is mostly not the sexy stuff, but is in fact mostly containers, the boxes that can be loaded directly from ships onto trucks. That's been probably the most important single factor. But all of that really kicks in over the period from about 1990 to 2010. And so both the obvious high technology boom and the globalization boom are coming after the big increase in the premium for college-educated workers. We can ask what was going on between 1980 and 1990. It's probably, there's some technological factors, no doubt, in there. There's other things. There's the decline of unions. There's we can talk about a number of things that might have been going on, but it's not obvious that the story that says that globalization and technology mandate a much higher level of education for the workforce, and therefore that's driving matters is true anymore. Just as an aside, if we're talking about technology and globalization, one of the things that I think has not quite sunk in to the way most people talk about it is that as far as the numbers go, both of those seem to have the great days of both, at least for the moment, seem to be behind us. That's very clearly true when it comes to globalization. That international trade really grew a lot. Actually, perspective here. In the long run of history, there was a period. There was a period when technologies of transportation and communication really created a global economy that, in a way, that had never existed before. And that period was 1870 to 1913, and the technologies were steamships, railroads, and telegraphs. That created a huge wave of growth in international trade, which then subsided for 45 years, mainly because it's kind of hard to do a lot of international trade when there are U-boats sinking your ships and that sort of thing, and protectionism and all of that. And then up until about 1990, the growth in international trade was, as a share of world gross domestic product, was only more or less recovering to what it had been in 1913. Then from 1990 to about 2010, you had this huge surge to levels of international trade that had never happened before, mostly having to do with vertical disintegration of production Instead of you produce a good and then you ship it, you do part of a good, you ship the components on, they're assembled into something bigger, then on and on. So you have it's the iPhone. An iPhone is assembled in China, but only something like under $10 of the cost of the iPhone actually represents Chinese value added. All of the components are coming from other places. So that's the kind of something that led to this huge increase in international trade, which, however, that era seems to have come to an end about 7, 8 years ago. Since the trade dropped off during the Great Recession, bounced back up as the world recovered, but there's been no upward trend since then. So it looks like we've kind of reached the limits. That actually ties back to my sewing machine operator story. It looks like businesses pushed globalization, actually realized that they pushed it a bit too far. So that process, at least for now, it seems to have come to an end. And then on technology, there's this running debate. If we look at numbers that measure productivity, that measure the attempts to measure the effect of technology on business productivity, we had a big surge from about the middle of the 1990s to the middle of the last decade, and not much since then. And it looks almost as if we kind of did that bit. And then there's this huge debate about whether this is just a pause and you ain't seen nothing yet, or whether actually this is something really big is still about to happen. But it is funny that there is a dissonance these days between the hype that we still attribute to technology and what the actual extent of change, which has been not that much in recent years. My favorite line, even though it comes from a horrible person, that gets us into politics, but was that we were promised flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters. And that's there's a little bit of the iPhone 7. This is an iPhone 6. I'm ashamed. It's all about iPhone 7 is, as everybody knows, it's almost indistinguishable. So we seem to be at a pause. So whatever those forces of technology and globalization have done to education, to demand for workers, probably, at least for the time being, not much is going on. And maybe just around the corner, the robots change everything, but we don't see that just yet. All right, that's my debunking part. Now something that's a little bit, where is STEM in the economy? How big a deal is it? And as it happens, Bureau of Labor Statistics does do they've are now collecting data that are really quite useful. I suppose you might quarrel with, you can always nitpick at it, but it's got to be a pretty decent picture. And I'm not sure whether to think of this as being huge or not. This is what they say about STEM in the economy. This is employment, first of all. So for what it's worth, total U.S. employment is about 140 million. And so total, what they consider to be STEM employment is about 17 million. So it's a bit over 10% of the workforce. Although what's interesting is that half of it they think is in healthcare. So what they're calling STEM is largely doctors, trained medical professionals of one kind or another. What often people think of as being the stuff that people usually think of as STEM, non-medical, is more like a little bit under 6% of the workforce. So it's not as if we have an economy that is dominated by these professions, though it's not trivial. I guess I'm happy that some kind of, social science, does that mean I'm a STEM worker? I guess so. Or post-secondary teaching, so I guess I am. But it's economics is always one of the, it's always kind of an ambivalent field here. But yeah, but basically, engineers, technologists, scientists are significant but not huge. Is this a rapidly growing part of the economy? And the answer is actually no. If you look at, so the bottom line is the share of STEM occupations, sorry, not STEM, of high-tech industries as defined by this. High-tech industries are defined as industries that have a lot of STEM workers, basically. And the BLS classification, anyway, says it's about 12% of total employment are in those industries. And there's basically been no trend. It's basically been flat for 20 years, which is not, I think, what people have in mind. But if you actually think about it, actually how many people are actually engaged in producing as opposed to using high-tech products, and it's not all that large and still remains fairly small. Now, the upper line is the share in output, which is higher. Also doesn't have much of a trend base, but it's and the reason that's so much higher is mostly that we are talking about workers who are a lot more highly paid. So if you look at the value of what they produce, it's a much higher share than their share of the workforce, and so now we're up to 20-something% of the economy, which is a pretty big deal, but not gigantic. And that's always the way it's going to be, right? If you actually ask, what does the American worker of 2016 do? And the answer is that she or he is probably sitting in a cubicle doing some kind of office work. And if we ask will the worker of 2036 do, it will probably look pretty much the same. That it will, we are, and the point is, overwhelmingly, we are people who do office work, do service occupations. Some of that is going to look high tech. Some of it is going to make use of STEM. Probably never. It's never going to be true that most of it is. I mean, that's even during the peak of the Industrial Revolution, it was never the case that a majority of workers were in manufacturing, and that's even going to be more so now. And in many ways, particularly if you think about what are the real growth sectors for employment, a lot of it looking forward is going to be healthcare. A lot of it is going to be healthcare-related occupations, not all of which are highly technical, many of which just involve some kind of much-needed personal service. So STEM is, well, it's big enough that it matters a lot. And it's big enough so that it's an important contribution to the economy. And that countries or economies that do well at it will have a significant leg up on economies that won't. But you don't want to think of it. We're not heading for a future in which everybody's a STEM worker. We're not heading for a future in which STEM is the whole economy. It's always going to be the case that more mundane things are going to be a very large part of what we do, which is okay. All right. So let me. The problem I have in doing this, especially to this audience, is that then I'm worried that I'm going to come up with with you having the impression that because these kind of crude, naive, oh God, we don't have workers with the right skills, therefore we can't employ them, and we don't, or that everybody, that basically the vision that having people who are trained engineers or scientists are the only workers we're going to need. That's a really wrong view. It's a wrong view about the current situation. It's even a wrong view about the future. But am I saying that education doesn't matter? And no, obviously not. But what's interesting, at least as far as I read it, okay. Now here's the point where I am not an education and economic performance expert. I just play one on TV. Anyway, no, on platforms. As my understanding of the research as it now stands, is that it basically says quality matters more than quantity. At least once you're at a level of as much education as the United States or any other advanced country has. That there's not a lot of evidence that there's very much payoff to having the average number of years of education that our workers receive go up. I mean, there must be some. It's got to be worth something, but it doesn't. It's not really striking. It just does not look as if lack of sufficient number of people with college degrees lack of sufficient number of years of education per worker are important factors holding back the economy. But to the extent that we can measure quality of education across countries, and there appear to be large differences in that, especially in developing countries, but even among advanced countries, that does seem to make a difference. So this is from a World Bank report. Now it's a pair of charts, and the second chart shows average years of education versus economic growth. This shows a measure based on test scores, which we know are an imperfect measure, but still based on test score evidence on the quality of education. And it's a much stronger relationship, a very clear one, that countries which have high test scores, which, as you might notice, tend to be Asian at this point, have been much more successful at rapid economic growth than countries that have low test scores, Peru, Philippines, Argentina, Chile. It makes sense when you think about it. And it is saying that the quality of education, even though this is a poor measure, but it's still good enough to see this, the quality of education is what really matters a lot. That your ability to have students who not only possess a degree, who've not only spent a bunch of time in school, but have actually come out understanding the material and are able to do it matters a lot for economic performance. So, which is saying that if we're trying to improve our performance, then the focus is not so much raw number of engineers that we're graduating as how good is the instruction, how well are we actually training them. And how do you do that? Well, not my department. No, I mean, really not. I try to do it myself, or have done, because I guess I'm teaching a sort of a STEM field. And of course, it's hard. And just maybe I should just close with a personal reflection, which is the hard part always. It must be true in other fields as well. The hard part in teaching economics is neither getting students to care about the issues, nor really teaching them the mechanics of the technical stuff. It's getting them to understand, to really feel that the two of them have a linkage, that the tools you're laying out actually do give them a way to bear in on stuff they care about. And the constant problem you have, even at Princeton, where I used to teach, is that students come into an economics course. They want slogans. They want upbeat PowerPoint presentations. Some of them, not the best, obviously. And then they encounter all this math, and a fair number of them say, "Well, what's this?" And then some of the others just so they learn the math, and then they don't sort of understand what you're supposed to do with it, which is in some ways the most frustrating thing. But in any case, the important thing, as far as I can tell, and insofar as this kind of very crude data tells you, is that the quality, getting students to actually understand the stuff, is what really matters. Good news is, I don't think don't despair about uneducated population. We appear to have people who have enough quantity of education, and the problem seems now to be mostly one of quality. I guess on that note, thank you.